Samir, thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here. In a way, this is the logic group, and philosophy and computer science people are here, and that's my home base where I grew up in, so thank you. Okay, and for here, this is something very different. It's so what can theoretical computer science contribute to the discussion of consciousness? And let's see, why isn't my screen going? Okay, and here are the three authors, actually. Manuel Blum, who's actually here today, and he's listening in, who's had a long-term interest in the brain, and Alan Blum, who is an expert in machine learning, and there's me, and I'm interested in non-standard models of computation. And we've sort of coming from different angles, but this has been really a fun project. Mellon and I have been working on it for a few years, and then realized that Avram could contribute in many ways. So what is consciousness? Roughly speaking, consciousness or conscious awareness is everything you pay attention to when you're awake or dreaming, but not dreamless sleep. It's what you see, what you hear, what you feel, what you smell, what you taste, your joys, fears, sorrows, pains, and most especially your own inner private speech. There I am. So there are various approaches to the study of consciousness. Of course, it was the purview for many years of theologians and philosophers, going way back in philosophy, Confucius, Plato. And today, a number of philosophers really focus on consciousness. And I have two names up here, Charles Dennett and David Chalmers. And they represent, in some ways, the two sides of the spectrum. One might say Dennett's a functionalist and Chalmers a phenomenologicalist. And we tend to be a little closer to the Dennett side. But also there's psychological approaches going back to William James, Sigmund Freud, people looking at the neural correlates, which we can do now with the advent of fMRI. And we have Francis Crick, the Nobel laureate, and Christoph Koch, who started looking at neural oscillations and spikes. Then there's a whole group that looks at measures of consciousness, and that's Giulio Tononi and Koch too. That's, you may have heard of integrated information theory. They give axioms and a measure phi, which is supposed to be a measure of consciousness. And then you have the cognitive neuroscientists, particularly Bernard Baars, Stanislav Dehaene, and Alan Baddeley. And they take an architectural point of view, which is close to the perspective that we're going to take here. So again, to ask the question, what can mathematics and theoretical computer science do now, where we have all these other people looking at consciousness? Well, we also want to understand consciousness. And we want to give a simple mathematical model to help us get that understanding. That's the way we think, to get simplicity. We want a good definition of chunk. And in the 50s, the psychologist George Miller talked about the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. And that was sort of the amount of information, the chunk size, the number of chunks perhaps that you could keep in your short-term memory at any one time, the amount of digits you could sort of have that somebody gives you a telephone number that you could jot down. So it could be a word, it could be a digit, it could be a poem, first phrase, where you know the first phrase and lead you to the second phrase and so forth. So what we want to do is give some precise definition within our model for that notion. And we want very much to distinguish between simulating and experiencing, and I'll give you some examples. We want properties of consciousness to be emergent, not programmed in. And we're not looking for a model of the brain. Many people are, we're not. Nor of learning or cognition. We're just simply focusing on a model of consciousness. Whether we want to do other things later on, maybe, but right now it's just on consciousness. We're looking for simplicity, not complexity. And we'd also like a blueprint for building a conscious-like machine. And we have some colleagues, particularly Jean-Louis Villacroze, who's helping us do some modeling. So in 1995, David Chalmers, who I already mentioned, posed two ways of thinking of consciousness. And he talks about what he calls the easy problem and the hard problem. So the easy problem, as he says it, is the problems of consciousness, which seem directly susceptible to the standard methods of cognitive science, whereby a phenomenon is explained in terms of computational or neural mechanisms. And this is sometimes called functional or access consciousness. But the really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. When we think and perceive, there is a whir of information processing, but there's also a subjective part, and this is what we would call phenomenal consciousness, or he would call that. And this is usually associated with the word qualia. If you hear any talks, they'll always talk about qualia, the feeling of what it is like, the feeling of what it is like to be a bat. And many focus on what it feels like when you see red. And I've given this talk in China, and I believe when they see red, they see something very different than when I see red. Okay, they feel something different. Okay, but we've reformulated the easy and hard problems for our purposes. And so we would say the easy problem is to make a robot that simulates feelings, for example, of pain and joy. And the hard problem is to make a robot that truly experiences feelings of pain and joy. And to understand the problem of simulating versus experiencing, here you see Sophia. She's simulating lots of emotions and she ends up with pleasure and joy. And though her expressions may simulate pleasure, she has what we call is acute anhedonia. Philosophers might say she's a zombie. And anhedonia is the reduced ability to experience pleasure. And it's often caused by damage to this part of the brain that's right here. It's called the nucleus accumbens. I want to mention that there's been a lot of work by cognitive neuroscientists on pleasure. And there's two people in particular I want to mention, is Baars and Kringelbach, because they've looked at pleasure and they've dissected into like three parts, three components. What they call reduced and anticipatory pleasure, the wanting of it, the liking, and the learning, actually wanting, liking, learning, and anhedonia is the reduction of those qualities. So they've reduced it to those parts. And what they showed is that earlier studies that showed that there were pleasure centers in the brain that if you kept on poking them, rats would start to learn to poke them and do it in so much so that they would actually die from starvation because they wouldn't eat. And they were able to show that this is really more the addictive part of the wanting that keeps on, not what we would call pleasure. So they sort of debunked this idea that there's a single pleasure center, but that's besides the point now. You may have seen robots simulating pain, and there's one on the internet that's really hard to watch because the pain is so terrific. But this robot again has what we call pain assimboli, and again it's another calamity when somebody gets bunked on the head and they have some damage to the insular. And it is a condition where pain is experienced without unpleasantness. And you might think that this is a good thing, but it turns out it's not a good thing at all. People who are born with this condition don't live very long. And if you get it later on, it's kind of difficult as well. So, and in fact, I was noticing that those two places that could be injured for both the instance not having pleasure, not having pain, are very close in the brain. So our view of consciousness is that consciousness is a property of all properly organized computing systems, whether they're made of flesh or blood or metal and silicon. And our thesis is that it's the architecture of these systems what makes them conscious. Many cognitive neuroscientists agree consciousness has to do with the architecture of the brain. And our architecture explains the brain at a very, very high level of abstraction, at a level well above that of neurons. And when I say architecture, I also mean the dynamics of what's going on inside as well. We give a formal definition of a machine for consciousness, which we call the Conscious Turing Machine, CTM, or Conscious AI. And then we define consciousness in that model and then point out properties of consciousness in the model. And we are inspired by Turing's simple yet powerful model of the computer that helps give understanding of computation. And so here I have a 23-state universal Turing machine. This is one that was designed by Marvin Minsky. I believe it's in his book on finite state machines. And it can compute any computable function. In other words, if you compute something in the cloud or in a supercomputer, you can do it on this Turing machine. But you can get your head around a Turing machine, but not the cloud. Thus, inspired by Turing, we're aiming for simplicity again, which I'm emphasizing, not complexity. And our architecture formalizes the theater model or the global workspace model of cognitive neuroscientist Bernard Baars. And Baars describes conscious awareness through a theater analogy. And he says that consciousness is the activity of actors in a play performing on a stage of working or short-term memory, which we call STM, short-term memory, and the inner speech actor is often on stage. And their performance is under observation by a huge audience of unconscious processes in long-term memory that are sitting in the dark. So if I were on stage and you were in an audience that was darkened, I would be the actor, and you would be listening in the dark to what I was saying. And you might have some comments and want to come up on stage and take over my role too. So some of you might feel you want to do that. Okay, so let me give you an example that you've probably experienced, which sort of shows how this short-term memory, the stage versus the audience of long-term memory processors, unconscious processors. So I've had this experience that you're at a party and you see somebody and you just can't for the life of you remember that person's name, but you go home and about a half hour later, the name comes to you. So what's going on in your unconsciousness? Well, your unconsciousness was working hard and you recall where you first met. Maybe that was in a math class. And that gets up to short-term memory. We hear it gets broadcast down to the audience, the long-term memory processes, the unconscious processors. And then that figures out something what she does. She's a logician. That gets up to the short-term memory, the stage, it gets broadcast down. And then one of the processors in the unconscious processes, her name begins with T, goes up again, and it gets brought down, and then we say her name is Tina. So her name Tina comes out. So a half hour later, her name comes up to the stage, the conscious short-term memory, from the audience of unconscious long-term memory processors, which has been thinking, searching. So the conscious self on stage doesn't know how or where her name was found. It just like pops up. The conscious self is not in general privy to the workings of the unconscious self. And I think many of you know the story of Henri Poincaré. He tells that he'd been working very hard on a problem day and night, and luckily a colleague had asked him to go on actually a really interesting trip. And he says as he was about to board the bus, this idea came to him without anything in my former thoughts seeming to have paved the way for it. That these two things he knew very much about, the transformations I had used to define Fuchsian functions, were isomorphic to those of non-Euclidean geometry. And Hadamard talks about this and others, and you may have had this experience yourself, maybe in not such a dramatic way, but the ideas of things you know about that you hadn't realized were connected, get connected. And that's your unconscious processors working in the dark. So here's Bernard Baars' model of consciousness. So in the center here, he has the working storage, that's our short-term memory, and that's the stage. And down here, he has an enormous collection of long-term memory processors, those are the audience. On the left here, he has inputs coming from the environment and they're being processed through some sensors for vision, hearing, and they go to the working storage. On the right, we have an output to the actuators that are doing some action to affect the outside world, the environment. And in the center, we have a central executive who may be helping with overseeing all these operations. Okay, so now I'd like to get to our structure, which is very influenced by Baars, and this is our Conscious Turing Machine. And what I'm going to do first is give you the sketch, the picture, a little like you give the picture of a Turing machine. And here's our picture. So we start with a tiny short-term memory. This is a read-write memory. This is conscious, it's very small, and that's our stage. The stage can hold, in our case, one chunk of information. I haven't defined chunk yet, but here's the actor holding one chunk of information. If we want more chunks like the 7 plus or minus 2, we could do some kind of circular things going up and revert, going back and forth. But we want to be simple, so let's start with just one chunk. Then we have an enormous collection of long-term memory processors. This is an enormous collection of maybe random access machines, parallel processors. And we start out that these processors, like the audience members, may be independent and not connected at all at first until maybe later on the connections will form when people start interacting. Okay, so that's how we start. These long-term memory processors, one can think of them as, so this unconscious processors, one might think of them as the sleeping experts, and they get awoken every so often and do things. And they have built-in very powerful memory, and through feedback, they have learning mechanisms in them, and one is called the sleeping experts algorithms, which are due to Alan Blum, are built in. And these algorithms are quite nice because they can help these processors if they've made mistakes or too bold. If they're too bold, they sort of calm them down. If they're too timid, these algorithms give them more weight. Okay. So we have eliminated the central executive. Again, we want to be very simple. If we don't need something, we want to eliminate it. So we've eliminated the central executive from Baars's model because that function either merges from the activity of unconscious processors, or one of the long-term memory processors can take that role when needed. So we've eliminated that. We have external inputs, and those are read-only inputs, and those are taking inputs from the outside world. And we have external output over here, which has actuators which can affect the outside world. Okay, and then we have a down tree, which is what it looks like, a down tree from short-term memory to all the long-term memory processors. I'd say we have about, maybe we're thinking something like 10 to the 7th processors actually down there, which is about the number of cortical columns in the brain. So we're thinking about 10 to the 7th is what we're looking for, a lot of them. And all of them get the beliefs of the down tree. The up tree here, we have an up tree. So we have a down tree and we also have an up tree. And the up tree here is binary. And it turns out we can, for our purposes, we want simplicity, and we can, for all intents and purposes, get away with an up tree. And the reason for the up tree is it's the one that controls the competition to get for audience members or processors to get their information up on stage. So let me give you an example of what's going on here. So what's going on here is each of these processors are giving into a competition a chunk of information. And a chunk will be formally defined as a tuple. And the tuple has a number of components. I've given you 4 of the major ones. It has an address of the processor. It has a gist, which is a small amount of information, very small amount of information. It has a weight of the gist, and it has a mood that's associated with the gist. And here, I've only shown you 2 parts of the tuple. I've shown you that we have a gist, a fear gist, for example. It could be a little bit detailed about what that fear is saying, and a mood there. And to start out with, in the competition, the mood starts out in the weight. So let me just show you this particular competition function here. In fact, it's a very simple one, but the one that we advocate is just slightly more complicated than this, but not much more. So let's see what's happening. So it looks like the pain processor put into a chunk into the competition, and so did the joy processor. And at this point, we have pain with a mood of -5 and a joy with a mood of +3. Since the absolute value of the mood here is larger, this chunk wins out, and the mood becomes the sum of the two moods. So in fact, what happened, because there was a little bit of joy, that tended to lower the mood, to increase the mood from -5 to -2, so it sort of helped out here. Now we have pain, this one, this chunk, competing with this chunk here. Fear has a higher absolute value of its mood, so it moves up, and that's the sum, so it's -7. So pain and fear work together to get even the mood higher than it had been previously, and so forth. So that's how it goes. In a more general model, we actually use a weighted coin toss to make our decisions at these juncture nodes. And the model that we generally use is this model, the probabilistic model, and it's even more powerful than the non-probabilistic model. Okay, so look what's happening. When a chunk gets up, after the competition, some chunk gets up into short-term memory, and immediately through the downtree, it gets broadcast to all the long-term memory processors. So they get to see it immediately. Okay. Hopefully, no questions. We'll see. So let me show you the general dynamics of how this Conscious Turing Machine works. So we have inputs. Now, if you recall in Baars' model, the inputs went to the short-term memory first and then got worked on. We only want the short-term memory just to hold a little bit of information. So what we're doing with our model is having it bypass, not to go into short-term memory, but go directly to the long-term memory processors. So we have an external world, we have a sensor like eyes and ears, and it's sending in information. And it's sending information which it gets what we might call worldish, and it's converting it to brainish, which is the internal language of our CTM, our Conscious Turing Machine. And it sends it not to all the processes, but some. So this eye and ear is sending something to faces and fear and so forth, this particular one. And now what's happening at this point in time, because information is and chunks are going into competition all the time, these processors are sending up chunks, and perhaps the one that came from the fear processor won the competition and got into short-term memory. So it went up the up true, and it won with fear -7 up there. As soon as it's up there, it's broadcast down to all long-term memory processors, but in particular, speech happens to get it as well, and it reacts and sends an output to the external output to the actuator, which screams there. And so we have now in that output map, we have brainish converted to worldish and screaming there. So that's, in short, how it goes. Let me just quickly go through this thing again. Input, competition, winning a competition, down to all long-term memory processors. Some of them decide to respond to that, and that's sort of the general dynamic. Meantime, all these long-term memory processors are doing their things up. If they didn't win the competition, they're sort of seeing why they didn't win. Did they make a mistake, or was it irrelevant, or whatever? And they're updating their information all along. Okay, if you notice that speech responded to fear, so long-term processor A will link up to B when B answers A's call. So this is how the links start to form. When a processor sees that something that other processors is answering its queries or things like that. And this is the Hebbian So it's like the Hebbian rule that says neurons that fire together wire together. And after a while, more and more links will form and they become stronger in the model. And that turns, linking enables conscious processing, which had to go through short-term memory to start, to become unconscious. And that's how unconscious in our model processings work. So these processors now can send chunks back and forth to each other without going through short-term memory and keep on working. And also this linking, in effect, modifies the uptree topology, that two things might have been far away and couldn't affect each other. Once they have links going, that's really changing the topology. Okay, so now for the definition. The chunk in short-term memory is what we call the conscious content of our Conscious Turing Machine. And consciousness in the Conscious Turing Machine, we say, is the awareness or the reception by all long-term memory processors of the conscious content of CTM. So the conscious content is up here in short-term memory, and then it gets broadcast immediately down, and that's when we say that the Conscious Turing Machine becomes aware of the content, of the conscious content. And what's happening here is that there's a constant activity of chunks moving upwards to compete to get into the short-term memory and then broadcast down. And this creates a constant stream of consciousness. It's sort of what James called the stream of consciousness. This is happening all the time. At every moment of time, this is happening. This is constantly going on. So I've now shown you the picture. And in fact, what we do, in fact, is we can formalize this, and we then can say the Conscious Turing Machine, the CTM, you can forget about consciousness, CTM, is a 7-tuple STM, LTM, downtree, uptree, links, input, output, and those can be all formally defined. And coincidentally, you can define a Turing machine as a 7-tuple also, but that's just a coincidence. So that's how we do formalize this pictorial model. And the reasonableness of our definition of consciousness lies in a number of concepts the model explains easily and naturally. And let me give you one that has to do with blind sight and action. Just checking my time. So here you see a man sitting on a sofa here on the right in a very cluttered room, like an obstacle course. There's a door on the other side. And the man is asked to go to the other room. Maybe there's food there, or there's a party or whatever. And he says, but I can't see. And then he gets up and he walks to the door, avoiding obstacles. Okay, what's going on? So here's a very high level explanation using the model of what's going on. So he's getting inputs from the external world, maybe something he's hearing that person say, go to the other room. And from the eye sensor, information is going into the vision processor. And then the vision processor works properly and it sends messages to the walk actuator, muscles, and he walks to the other room. But the connection to short-term memory is broken or may not exist. And without access to short-term memory that would get broadcast down, he has no conscious sense that he can see. So nothing's going up into short-term memory to be conscious content and then be consciously aware going down to all the long-term memory processes. But now for our big question, we've made definitions of conscious content, conscious awareness. Will our CT have the feeling of consciousness or that it is conscious? Okay, yes or no? We believe that yes, but how do we prove that the Conscious Turing Machine, the CTM, feels conscious? Well, we don't. But the reasonableness of our definition of consciousness lies entirely in the explanation it gives for consciousness, the range of concepts that CTM explains easily and naturally, the extent to which those explanations agree with our intuitive feelings about our own consciousness, and also what other people say, the neuroscientists say, and the CTM's response to situations unforeseen by CTM's creator. And we argue that the feeling of consciousness is a consequence of CTM's, these three things, its architecture, the processes in the CTM, and the dynamics. And more specifically, all long-term memory processors know what's going on in short-term memory. And so in particular, those long-term memory processors that are particularly responsible for consciousness get that information. Okay, and the confluence of, and I'm going to go into some of these long-term memory processes in a minute. The third feature is that the confluence of feedback, learning, and prediction within the long-term memory process is also a component. And we call that the predictive dynamics. People in the field sometimes call it, it's something like predictive processing. And this includes the work of feedback, sleeping experts, algorithms, and prediction in our model. Another feature is the constant bubbling of chunks forming the stream of consciousness. And some broad general ability may be minimal to think, including motivation, energy, and drive. So let me talk about a few of the long-term memory processors that we believe are particularly responsible for the feeling of consciousness. So an inner speech or dialogue processor for planning, forecasting, that translates the speech in STM that's in brainish into inner speech that's a little bit like the hears from the external world. So when a chunk gets up into STM and it goes down and maybe it has some, it's a scene with people talking that's being in the gist, STM will send information then to an inner speech, to the inner speech processor, which will send to the hearing processor something that acts a little bit like hearing. And so we have inner speech turning speech into something that we seem to hear inside ourselves. So there is something about not hearing words inside or actually computing without, or being conscious without having symbols. But most of the time we have our inner speech, we're talking to ourselves and we can sort of hear ourselves talk to ourselves. Similarly, we have an inner vision and sensation or sensation processors, which translates brainish sketches into what the mind's eye or senses, for example, in dreams. And then also, very importantly, is a collection of processors, which we call the model of world processors, for generating and recalling personal maps of CTM's world, inner and outer, for distinguishing self from not self in those worlds. And here I have a little baby who's actually starting to form this model of the world and sort of seeing he can actually think and move his, this is I think his left leg. So he's seeing that the left leg is part of self, and every so often he's trying to actually see that the right leg is part of self. He hasn't quite gotten there yet. So he's also predicting actions of self and not self in CTM's world. So that's what this model of the world processor is doing in this baby. And it will do the same in the CTM. And then it plans actions in the environment as this baby was trying to do. It couldn't quite get its right leg to move, at least at that point in time. Okay. And actually, George Gallup's mirror test of self-awareness captures at least 3 of our requirements for consciousness. The model of the world. So the mirror test is a test that's been done on a number of animals whereby the researcher puts a mark on the animal's forehead and then shows the animal a mirror, and after a while, one wants to see whether that animal can know that that is a mark on itself, that it's on itself, or it just thinks it's another animal in the mirror. Okay, so this mirror test seems to capture model of the world, a processor for distinguishing self for not self, an inner dialogue for planning. So if this animal is going to take that or rub that marker off, it's got to do some planning, how it's going to take its limbs and move it off, or do something like rub up against a rock or something like that. And some ability to think, including the motivation and energy to do something. And so, for example, this is when I've done a lot of things. You may have seen these videos about elephants passing the mirror test. And let me show you. So here we have an elephant, and here's a video. So this elephant, if you can see over there, has a mark of an X on its forehead, and he's just looking at the mirror and doesn't seem to be doing anything, hasn't learned. But if you look at this elephant, it's really quite remarkable. You see he's taking his trunk and trying to get that space, that mark off, and every so often, let me see if we can see that again. It's really remarkable, that part. So it has to do some planning, and it has the energy to actually watch it there. You see, it's scraping it off, and it's checking back in the mirror to see if it's off. And then it does it again, and that's quite remarkable. But the question is, do others, animals or pass that aren't mammals pass this test? Some mammals do not. Gorillas don't pass it because they're not looking in the eye of another gorilla is a kind of an aggressive act, and they will start to fight. So some animals do not, that you might think would pass the mirror test, do not. You have to do other tests. But there's a fish, a tiny fish called a cleaner wrasser fish. It goes in and cleans the mouth of other large ferocious fish. And they've been able to do the mirror test with these fish, put something on their forehead, so to speak. And when these fish see this, they do all sorts of things to check out whether it's really them. And when they see it's them, they go to a rock and try to rub it off. There's a species of ants that does the same sort of thing, that when it sees a mark on its forehead, then will go to and try to rub it off as well. So this kind of self-awareness seems to be prevalent at many levels of species. Oh yeah, here is a young child. Is that child passing the mirror test? I'm not sure of anything on there, but that child's trying to, at first it doesn't realize that it's seeing itself. And it's sort of looking behind, and now looking there and sort of testing it out. testing it out. And then only it does realize it, and then sees another person there. So that child is sort of has a lot of self-awareness there, and seeing self and non-self. So I quickly, I have think about 10 minutes. Quickly want to talk about the hard problem with respect to pain and pleasure. So feeling pain. So, and how might this happen in our conscious Turing machine? So taking for what it happens in us. So what is, we try to understand what extreme pain is. Well, extreme pain is like an actor that hogs short-term memory, and it prevents all other actors from reaching the stage. Hence pain's message, only its messages and only its messages are broadcast. So this CTM or us, we can't do anything else. So we've often seen soccer players who get injured and you know, they fall to the ground, they can't get up. Many people will say that this guy is just simulating the pain to get extra time, and maybe that's true or maybe not. But a friend of mine, Brian Hayes, who writes about mathematics, told me about the experience he had. He was at an office, he was visiting MIT, he was in an office, and all of a sudden he got this excruciating pain, and he had to lie down on a rug in his office, and he couldn't even reach for the phone to call somebody. He just couldn't do anything. The pain was blocking out every single, it was so painful, it was blocking out everything else. So pain was a blocking out everything else. The blocking out is the pain. Until a policeman came by, you know, checking out offices and saw him on the ground there and called the medics. So in a brain processor, the way it acts in the CTM, it gets its weight when something's injured extremely, it will make its weight so high that the weight of the chunk, there's a gist with the weight and mood and all that, will be so high that it will win out the competition and hog the stage and stay there, keep on staying there for a very, very long time. And the CTM or the person can't do anything, and that's a very, very painful thing. So that's one of our arguments for pain. We have others as well, including interrupts. But I just wanted to give you a feeling for how we're starting to look at feelings in this conscious Turing machine. Looking at pleasure, so here are some examples of what we might call pleasure, a mother's love, the alleviation of pain. And these things actually work together because early on a child or our conscious Turing machine knows, either because it's built in or by experience, that negative moods are to be avoided. So children and CTM learn that they can lessen a negative mood by seeking a positive mood. And as you saw in our chunks, we have these moods, and when a chunk gets into short-term memory, that mood is in general the mood of the CTM. And so built in or by experience, CTM learns that negative moods are to be, and the baby, to be avoided. So that's how love is associated with the alleviation of pain. On the other hand, we do not learn in general, except in pathological or bad cases, to avoid positive moods. So in this way, positive and negative moods are not symmetric. So we hypothesize that a system such as the CTM, built to attain homeostasis, to get into a kind of stable situation, its inherited predictive dynamics, will have a feeling of pleasure and well-being in its quest and attainment of that goal of homeostasis. And this aligns with some of the literature on pain and pleasure, Likeness and Tracy, Baars and Kringelbach, those are the people I mentioned before, who also suggest this attainment of homeostasis is related to pleasure. Okay. So that's sort of how we're starting to look at the feelings and looking at the hard problems of experiencing pain and pleasure in our CTM and our conscious, eventually conscious AI. I want to end with the extended mind. You may have read Andy Clark and David Chalmers' paper or Andy Clark's book about the extended mind. And they talk about how we always extend our mind, libraries extend our minds, reading extends our mind, other things. And then maybe we'll have implants that can extend our mind. And as you may have recently read or heard that Elon Musk's new Neuralink, most recent Neuralink, he has embedded that in Gertrude, who apparently has now a super extended mind. And we also have the extended conscious Turing machine mind, the extended conscious Turing machine. And so here you see the Turing machine, conscious Turing machine in toto, but what's slightly different from what you've seen before is we've added in addition to our memory process, our vision processor, our model of the world processor, and whatever, we've added, or in a speech processor, we've added all sorts of technology. Why not link it up to Google and Wolfram Alpha and Siri and AlphaGo and all of these other things? As the technology gets more and more powerful, those can be some of our long-term processors. So I'd like to end with that's our extended conscious Turing machine, and this is research in progress. We hope to have a short paper out shortly, a longer paper out longer, and thank you very much. And this is the end.